Thank you for that very kind introduction. And as you can see, my degree is slightly less fancy than these. But I'm getting close, so just a little more time on that. Okay, so as was sort of introduced already, my name is Brandon Saxon. I do have my master's degree, and I'm a fifth-year student in the clinical psychology doctoral program at North Dakota State University. And I'm the other half of the Jedi Counsel podcast and blog team. Some of my clinical experience that might be relevant to what we're talking about tonight includes I've done some individual therapy with individuals who have antisocial personality disorder, and I was also involved in the domestic violence program. So I worked as a group leader and an assessor for the program for perpetrators of domestic violence who were court mandated to be part of the program. So, and not to say that everyone involved in that program had an antisocial personality disorder, but certainly some of them did have the disorder and displayed some of those qualities. So that's some of my relevant clinical experience and education that sort of is tied into what we'll be talking about tonight.
I'm Katie Gordon, and I am a professor at NDSU, though similar to our previous presenters, none of these views reflect NDSU's views. These are the field views, but not NDSU. Or they may be NDSU. But anyway, so, what's that?
Ice enthusiast.
Yes, I'm not an ice enthusiast. I recently became one after that talk. That was great. So some of my experiences as a therapist is I provide mental health services for 3 years to adolescents in a correctional facility who had a range of criminal offenses, from arson to burglary to sex offenses to substance use related offenses. And so within that group of individuals, there were some that had characteristics of antisocial behavior that I'm going to talk about. And I also have worked with campus police before when they're trying to assess what to do in a situation, and sometimes there have been some antisocial behaviors involved in those situations.
Absolutely. And Katie and I started Jedi Counsel just over like a year ago or a year and a half ago, something like that. And it all started when we realized, so as individuals who have clinical psychology training, of course we have interest and passion in mental health advocacy and mental health education, but through some conversations we realized we have some more nerdy sort of sci-fi related interests as well, related to maybe one character you can sort of see looming in the background that we're talking about later, and as well as like comic books and stuff like that. So we kind of decided that one way to provide accurate mental health information might be through fictional characters, just because the characters are compelling and interesting, and it's just another mechanism through which we could teach and talk about mental health. You're squinting just a little, so maybe it's not as clear on the PowerPoint, but it's an obscure character known as Darth Vader.
Very subtle.
It's subtle, yeah.
He's also here.
He's all over. So no, that's okay. We'll talk more about that character later. So through some of these fictional characters, sometimes what we'll do is we'll talk about a specific disorder and how a certain character might have the disorder or mental health problems. Otherwise, what we'll do in a different sort of take is talk about how specific disorders or problems might be depicted, whether or not the depiction is accurate, and whether or not the depiction might be harmful or hurtful to the field or the individual struggling with those disorders on kind of on the whole. Yeah. Any questions so far about Jedi Counsel or anything we do? And also, this is going to be kind of an interactive talk too, so feel free to interrupt us at any given time. Okay, who here has either heard or used the term antisocial before? Okay, tell me some of the ways that you've used the term. In what context, or tell me, just throw a sentence out there that is a way that you've used the term antisocial. Yeah.
Person is antisocial.
What do you mean? They don't want to hang out with you. They're being antisocial. Sure. Anyone else have an example?
I am antisocial. I do not want to hang out with you.
You're antisocial. You don't want to hang out. Hopefully not with some of these things that we're talking about right here, but sure. Any other examples? That's a great example. I'm not. Yeah. Well, you're a social worker, sure. Yeah, so it's a term that maybe comes up in a more clinical component in your work, maybe relative to some of the other examples, which are perfectly common examples, absolutely. A lot of the times, and I'm someone who's done this in the past too, is say, yeah, I'm feeling a little antisocial. I don't like to hang out with people. And I think that's the way that it's commonly used in sort of everyday language. The way that we're going to talk about antisocial tonight is specifically within the realm of antisocial personality disorder, which is a specific disorder that's in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, or DSM. And is everyone or anyone familiar with what the DSM is? A couple people, one person did this, So I assume that means yes, and followed by a thumbs up. The DSM is sort of this handbook that contains all of the specific mental health diagnoses and disorders that mental health professionals use in their clinical work. So within the DSM, as antisocial personality disorder falls under the personality disorders chapter or cluster, maybe not surprisingly, and it consists of a couple of these specific things. So first of all, individuals who have or are experiencing an antisocial personality disorder display or exhibit a disregard or a violation for the rights of others, and that has to have occurred prior to age 15 for them to meet the diagnostic criteria. That disregarding or violation of rights can come up in a couple of the different ways, and they actually have to have at least 3 of the specific ones, and these are some of the examples. So criminal behavior, so engaging in any sort of criminal behavior, kind of eschewing sort of law-abiding behaviors and kind of bucking the system, not really engaging in it, sometimes can be resulting in arrest or things like that. Deceitfulness, this can come in the form of maybe lying, conning, manipulating other people for any sort of personal profit or personal pleasure, anything like that. Impulsivity, that's kind of a self-explanatory one, not a lot of examples, but just impulsive behavior, not a lot of forward thinking or looking into the future to really, what are going to be some of the consequences of the actions that I'm engaging in. Sensation seeking, sometimes these individuals can be a little bit prone to boredom, so they engage in reckless behaviors that can put themselves in harm's way or other people in harm's way. And lastly, aggression. Any sort of aggressive behaviors can be exhibited and acted upon with other individuals, and a lot of times with those aggressive behaviors, what you see is a pretty big lack of remorse for the other people who they've either hurt or mistreated in some way. So those are some of the examples of specific diagnostic criteria under an antisocial personality disorder.
So within antisocial personality disorder research, and this is one of, and I should say all of our information that we're going to talk about today is from scientific research. And antisocial personality disorder is a priority for research because it affects people negatively, right? There are higher elevated rates of it occurring among people who are in prison and things like that. So there's a lot of public interest in studying that. And one of the first ways that this pattern of behavior was identified was with a related concept that's not quite the same as antisocial personality disorder that's called psychopathy. And that was first really formally identified in 1941 by Cleckley, and it was based on clinical observations of individuals who appeared to be functioning pretty normally, but then did a lot of really messed up stuff. And so he called his book The Mask of Sanity because he was comparing it to individuals, for example, if someone's psychotic and has hallucinations and delusions, at times where their symptoms are in effect, you might be able to tell that they're having a hard time distinguishing reality from fantasy and those types of things. However, if someone has psychopathy, you might not be able to tell that. So they have the mask of sanity, and that's part of the danger that he outlined. And so what he did is, just starting off as a clinical observation, identify what he was seeing people doing, and these are the personality characteristics that he came up with. How many people have seen Frozen? Okay, Hans has a lot of these characteristics, so you can kind of keep him in mind. I'm Team Kristoff, in case you were wondering. So one of them is callous, and you'll see these are some overlapping with the criteria we just talked about. The diagnostic criteria focuses a lot on behaviors. This is more on personality. So callous has to do with the idea of not really caring how you affect other people, or the lack of empathy that's often associated with antisocial type behavior. Superficial charm is one of the things that fascinates a lot of people, including in the public, with individuals who have problems with antisocial behavior, because on the surface, if someone's callous and they don't have a lot of empathy, you think most people try to avoid them. But the problem is that this group of symptoms also comes with commonly this way of really getting people engaged, and we're going to see a quote about that that explores it more in a moment. But these individuals are good at being manipulative, and they're good at getting people to like them, even when they're doing horrible things, and that's part of what makes it dangerous. Another characteristic is being grandiose, so feeling smarter than they are. We're going to talk about Bundy in a minute, who was a serial killer, and for example, he was a bright person, but he wanted to represent himself, and there was a lot of evidence against him, and some people view that as an example of being grandiose rather than having a lawyer represent him. Frequent lying is another thing that you see a lot, And when I was working individually with clients who had these types of mental health problems, it was hard for me to understand why they would lie so much. But a lot of it had to do with getting out of trouble, which was more obvious, but other times it had to do with evoking particular emotional responses from other people. So they might tell some fantastic story that isn't true so that people would get really excited and impressed by that. And then manipulation is another part of it. So linking back to Frozen, Hans is really manipulating Anna into marriage and all these things after they just met. And later on, we find he's quite callous towards the sister Elsa. So even though it's a Disney cartoon, it's actually a pretty good representation of psychopathy. So the place that this stands now is that this is not in the DSM, but it is studied in research. And within all the people that have antisocial personality disorder, there's a smaller group that are identified as having psychopathy, and those are the individuals that tend to be more resistant to treatment, tend to have worse outcomes over time. And so it's still used regularly, something called the psychopathy checklist, to try to identify when people have psychopathy so that you might change your approach to treatment that way.
Can anyone think of any other fictional individuals who might be experiencing psychopathy? Before we talk about a real life example, we like to talk about the fictional ones for a variety of reasons.
Yes,
the Joker, yeah, that's a great
one.
example. One that we've talked about before. Yeah, anyone else? Dr. Hannibal Lecter is one. Yeah. Frank Underwood, yeah, that's a good example. These are just good ideas for us, for characters to talk about, so we don't have to think of our own, so let's keep them coming. Tyrion Lannister, yeah, that's an interesting idea. So, I would have to think about that. I don't know if he perfectly fits within the box of psychopathy.
Singing with the superficial charms and manipulation. You know, he fits a few of them.
He certainly does. Yeah, you wouldn't have to twist my arm very far to fit him into that box. Yeah, absolutely.
Would you say Cersei?
Oh, yeah.
I would say that's probably a more classic example. Yeah. Thank you. Keep them coming. This is kind of nice because this project allows me to ignore my real work by consuming media for the sake of education. Yeah. Like I said, we like to talk about some of the fictional examples because sometimes real life is a little more uncomfortable, and this is one specific example. It is important to note that not everyone who is experiencing psychopathy appears how you might see them in movies or TV shows like Dr. Hannibal Lecter or the Joker. Not everyone who has psychopathy is going to be presenting like these individuals. Sometimes those characteristics can be somewhat adaptive and allow them to advance in certain areas because they can be charming and they can connect with people in that way. And Ted Bundy is an example of someone who is certainly seen as intelligent, charming, and really articulate, but wasn't totally adaptive in his behavior, to be certain. But it is an example of how these characteristics can be exhibited. So following the trial for Ted Bundy, this is actually a quote from the judge, and I'll just read it for you. Not that you can't read, but I just like to hear my voice. So, it is ordered that you be put to death by a current of electricity. That current be passed through your body until you are dead. Take care of yourself, young man. I say that to you sincerely. Take care of yourself, please. It is an utter tragedy for this court to see such a total waste of humanity as I've experienced in this courtroom. You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer, and I would have loved to have had you practice in front of me, but you went another way, partner. Take care of yourself. I don't feel any animosity toward you. I want you to know that. Once again, take care of yourself. For an individual who assaulted and murdered over 30 other people, this is certainly an interesting thing that Ted Bundy could sort of convince the lawyer to have no animosity for him and really just be like, yeah, you could have been a really great guy. Take care of yourself, Ted. See you later. So it's just one of those examples where it's sort of interesting, and certainly a real life example where one of these, or an individual with psychopathy was able to really exhibit that charming intelligence and really connect with someone in that way.
And that's how he lured a lot of his victims,
Yep,
too.
absolutely.
It's very dangerous. But fortunately, as Brandon said, a lot of people who are psychopaths and antisocial are actually not violent. They can have other criminal behavior that's not violent.
Yeah. So now that we've taken a detour into real life time, let's get away from that. I guess there's a little more
Is
real
this
life
still
time.
real?
Yeah, until our fictional example.
So what causes people to turn to the dark side in real life? That's the whole purpose of this talk. So within psychology, something that's very challenging is that we acknowledge that it's a multitude of factors that lead to disorders. It's not, and it can be a different kind of mixture of factors depending on the person, and so it makes things very complicated. But one way we try to group them is by looking at biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors, all which kind of influence each other and have an impact. And so that's called the biopsychosocial model. So I'm just going to highlight some of the major risk factors that scientific research has identified as putting people at risk for antisocial personality disorder. In terms of biological risk factors, I have aggressiveness under there. There is research showing that individuals who have antisocial personality disorder tend to have higher levels of testosterone, and that's been linked to aggressiveness. So in fact, in some cases, they've tried to lower that as an intervention to decrease the aggression. Another biological factor is arousability, and basically all of us in this room kind of vary in how for example, if we're all watching a horror film, some of us, our hearts would be pounding and would be jumping. Other people might be more laid back and relaxed. People with antisocial personality disorder tend to have a lower resting heart rate. They have less of a physical response to stressful situations, and that's thought to be part of what's missing in the picture. So if they go rob a store and they still have like a pretty even heart rate, they're not breathing faster, their body's not telling them this is a really bad idea. And so that's part of what can go wrong in this picture. These characteristics are heritable. The way that we look at them to see if they're genetic is by looking at twin studies and comparing identical twins who have 100% of the same DNA to fraternal twins who have 50% shared DNA. If someone has antisocial personality disorder and you're an identical twin, there's a 50% chance of you having it too. With fraternal twins, it's 20%. So it suggests that there is a strong genetic component, but it's not everything, right? That still doesn't explain half of what the factors are. So the other parts of the factors have to do with environmental things, sociocultural and psychological factors. And one of the strongest studies that showed just how much the biology matters was a study that looked at individuals who were adopted away from their biological fathers, and they were looking at fathers and sons. And they looked to see if the biological father or the adoptive father's level of antisocial behavior better predicted the son's antisocial behavior, and it was the biological father. It was not the adoptive father who raised them. So that suggests the genes were passed on and having an effect even if they were raised in an environment that was separate from that person. So some of the other factors that come into play, low socioeconomic status, and that's for a few different reasons. One of them is that individuals who have low socioeconomic status tend to face more daily stressors as a result of not having the resources and to get their basic needs met. They also might act in criminal ways so that they can get things they need like clothes, food, and other things like that. So that can add a stressor. In terms of child maltreatment, what I'm referring to is individuals who as children have been the victims of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. And what the research shows is that for individuals who have been victims of child maltreatment, they're twice as likely to develop antisocial personality disorder. Most people who have experienced that don't, but we do see an elevated risk. And part of that link that research has identified is because when individuals are raised in an environment that's not safe, so where they're being abused, in order to adapt, kids might kind of be really vigilant about the things going around them so they can watch out for harm. They might overinterpret anything people do as potentially harmful so they can protect themselves. And what we find is that can stay, there are also brain changes, but it can also stay as a thinking pattern that's stable into adulthood. And so what we find is people who have antisocial personality disorder also have a hostile attribution bias. And what that means is that when they come across kind of neutral or ambiguous situations, they interpret it as hostile. So for example, if you're standing in line for something and someone bumps into you, most people would look and kind of check out the situation and see, oh, maybe they didn't see me, maybe they were on their phone and they walked into me, or something like that. The common pattern of thinking that you see in antisocial personality disorder is that person intentionally did that to disrespect me. And if you're thinking that, you're much more likely to hit someone. And that, I spent a lot of time in therapy just talking about thinking for a second, looking at the situation. Again, it's really sad because if you're raised in an environment that's hostile, it's kind of adaptive to be on the lookout and assume people are trying to harm you, but then it becomes problematic when you get out into the rest of the world.
Okay, so now we're done with the real life stuff, and we'll take a little detour into the fictional world a little bit. So I know I talked about this obscure character, Darth Vader, a little bit earlier. I want us all to work as a team a little bit to think about what are some of the risk factors that Anakin Skywalker may have experienced that led him down this path of turning to the dark side, becoming Darth Vader. So let's start with aggressiveness. Let's all think about Star Wars, Anakin Skywalker. What were some times where he might have exhibited some aggressive behaviors?
When he killed all the younglings?
He did kill all the younglings, traditionally aggressive behavior. Any other examples? He killed the Tusken Raiders in response to his mother's death. Yeah, absolutely. Any other examples? He really doesn't like sand. Not traditionally aggressive behavior, but maybe in this context, hard to say. Could be linked to the Tusken Raiders. Yeah, so he certainly engaged in a lot of aggressive behavior, especially killing that whole village of Tusken Raiders, including children and women and everyone. So yeah, really great examples. Arousability. Any examples of arousability in Anakin Skywalker?
Or he had low arousability.
Or low arousability. Yeah, thank you. Pod racing. Yeah, absolutely.
That might be some of the sensation seeking too.
Yeah. Anything else?
The first movie, age 3, and he's flying in battle in space, and he seems to be pretty wooden about the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another great example. You see that a few times. At one point, I think it might be in the second movie, he sort of jumps off a speeder in traffic and falls down. And Obi-Wan's comments sort of hint that he does this sort of silliness or really reckless behavior quite often. Also, rushing into battle with Count Dooku. This was like a pretty powerful Sith Lord, and he figured he could probably take on Count Dooku. Kind of rushed in without Obi-Wan. So these are definitely examples where he engaged in a little bit of reckless behavior, to be certain. So those are some of the
grandiosity too.
and some grandiosity, absolutely. So those are some of the biological ones. Thinking of some of the psychosocial or sociocultural examples, low SES. I mean, there's not a lot of examples for that. It's mostly more of a big check mark. Socioeconomic status, of course. He was born into pretty much nothing on Tatooine, was born a slave and had nothing coming up, which almost certainly also played a role in some of the childhood maltreatment that he experienced. Although he definitely had a kind mother who they seemed to have a really loving relationship, they got along really well, it's almost certain that he experienced some sort of maltreatment as a result of being a child slave and working for Otto and sort of being involved in some of that stuff. I think that was that little flying guy's name, Otto? Anyone? Watto, yeah, thank you. That was that trilogy. No, I'm just kidding. And then hostile attribution bias. Anyone have any examples of that where Anakin misinterpreted something as being hostile when maybe it wasn't in reality? The last fight with Obi-Wan, absolutely. At the beginning, they have this conversation where he's accusing Obi-Wan of being jealous of him and wanting to take power from him. And even Padme as well. He thinks Padme came there with negative intentions. He's convinced the Jedi Council won't make him a master because they're jealous of his powers and they want to keep him down to the point where that was a pretty big breaking point for him. That was the main reason why he was able to be manipulated by Darth Sidious and sort of take on the mantle of Darth Vader. So there's a lot of examples where he's misinterpreting these things as being much more hostile in intention than they really were. So it's pretty plain to see when you kind of go through some of these how he really kind of went down that pathway that we sort of outlined where someone could go down this path to experiencing an antisocial personality disorder.
So the bad news, as we've talked about, is all the criminal behaviors associated with antisocial personality disorder. So what we like to do is make sure and talk about how we can prevent these types of things. And there's been a lot of research looking at treatment for people who already have antisocial personality disorder. And one thing that makes it really hard is that people who have that aren't often motivated for treatment. They're often sent there because they're court ordered or their job is ordering them. So right off the bat, not being motivated to change is not usually a good thing for treatment. So that's one of the difficulties. One of the other difficulties is some of the lying and superficial charm can convince their therapist that they're doing really well. And there's research that suggests that, and they say, okay, they're ready to leave, and then they'll turn right around and do something else that's violent. And so that's really challenging. So to briefly sum up years of research, the best bet is to catch people when they're young and intervene before they're in age 18 and up. And again, there's a lot of variability. So Bundy is one extreme of antisocial personality disorder. Darth Vader is one extreme. But a lot of people who have lower levels, you can teach some things to minimize the harm to themselves and others. So with regard to intervening early, there's one particular treatment that's been shown to be most effective at reducing crimes. It's a very involved treatment, and up front it costs a lot of resources, but over time it reduces resources because there's much less likely that they're going to be incarcerated or hurt people. And that's multi-systemic therapy. And here's a website if you want more information, but the basic gist of it is, since the individual who has the antisocial issues might not be that motivated to change, you intervene in the environment around them. And the ways that you do that is you help their family learn how to effectively parent children who show antisocial behaviors. For example, one big thing is kids who have low arousability tend to not be afraid of punishment. So if you use punishment a lot when you're parenting, it doesn't actually have that much of an effect. But if you can capitalize on the reward-seeking behavior, you can see more behavior if you focus on how you're going to give them positive reinforcement rather than punish them. With regard to peers, this is difficult too because kids who engage in antisocial behavior tend to find each other and make things worse. And so if you can find ways to get pro-social peers or people who are doing that, that can help. Helping them to school with any learning problems, which we see higher rates of learning problems among these individuals. Going into the neighborhoods, reducing danger, and as a culture, trying to change the risk factors we can change. We can't change the genetics right now, but we can try to reduce the number of children that have low socioeconomic status. We can reduce the number of children who are victims of maltreatment, and those are some ways to reduce this type of behavior. Two things I want to mention that are not effective. Research shows loud and clear that you may have heard of. Boot camp is not effective. There have been kids really hurt by that. But if you think about someone who is not afraid of punishment, low arousability, and they're getting ordered around and they have a problem with authority, you can understand why that might not be a good match. Now, if you have a kid who's really has a lot of anxiety and put them in that situation, they'll get in line really quickly. But that's why it's important to focus on the type of thing you're treating. The other one that doesn't work that I should mention is scared straight. There is clear research that actually scared straight ends up increasing the risk of violent crimes for individuals who have been through the Scared Straight program. Now, the first version of Scared Straight, I don't know if anyone's seen the movie. It's pretty terrifying for someone like me, but it isn't that much for those kids. And it's harmful, and yet nonetheless, there's A&E has a Beyond Scared Straight. So even though we know it actually makes things worse, there's something that people like about watching kids getting yelled at and thinking they're going to get into line. And so A&E kind of perpetuates this idea. This isn't as interesting of a reality show, but it's much more effective. So I just wanted to let you know that there are effective treatments out there on a positive note.
Yeah. One positive note for the end. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a two-part question. Sorry if I missed this. One, how early can we start identifying some of these at-risk children? And also, how do we go about identifying them? Is this the job of teachers seeing violence on the playground, or are there some other areas that we can identify these kids?
I'm going to take this.
Sure.
So it's really interesting. There was a study that looked at 4-year-olds and followed up 25 years later, and they rated them on characteristics to see what would predict psychopathy. It's an amazing study. I mean, very long, and it's tough, but they did identify a couple things. One of them was being really extroverted and socially engaging, so that you already see the charm at that young age, and that seems to be associated with greater risk. But it's a real problem, because do we want to tell people that 4-year-olds have risk factors for psychopaths. So like biologically, you could hook them up to something, and one way that we look at fear response is you attach equipment to their eye, for example, and you show a scary picture. And how hard you blink is a decent representation of your fear response. So they'll show kind of pictures and things that would scare most people, and if a kid didn't react to that, then they might have low arousability, but they haven't developed the disorder yet. It's dangerous in terms of expectations from the parents that now you have a kid who might be a psychopath. And so it's a really tricky balance. So until the screening and assessment tools are much better, I can't see it immediately taking the kind of model that like autism has, where there are specific signs that pediatricians monitor everyone for. However, what you can do to catch individuals early is if you see these behaviors in middle school or high school, then it's time to get into treatment, and importantly into the right kind of treatment. The studies that look at this one compared to putting a kid into individual therapy, this works much better. And so it is usually the teachers and the parents. A lot of the kids that I worked with, unfortunately, their parents had a lot of antisocial behaviors. So it was really hard to engage the family in therapy. So there are a lot of obstacles here. Good question. Did that answer it?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's kind of our last slide. So we can open it up for any other questions. Just in closing, I'll say, we hope you enjoyed the talk and maybe learned a little something. And if you're interested in any of the other intersections between mental health and pop culture, we do have a website, www.jedi-counsel.com. You can find us on Twitter or Facebook, tweet at us or send us a message if there's any other characters, movies, games, TV shows, anything like that you think might be worthwhile looking into just because of the mental health that's depicted. Or email us. And yeah, we do the weekly or monthly blog posts. And our podcast is every week, and you can find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, or pretty much any podcast, app, website, anything like that. So if you have any questions, we're happy to take them. If you don't, we're happy to leave. Yes?
Who's your favorite character that you guys analyzed?
That's a great question. My favorite character that I analyzed overlaps with my favorite fictional character in general, which is Batman, Bruce Wayne, which I talked about at the last Nerd Night talk that we gave. I don't have to go into too much detail. It was just really cool to analyze Bruce Wayne because he is my favorite character. So really getting into the character and thinking about the history and some of the things that are going on in his mind and being able to contribute something on the internet somewhere that was about Batman was pretty special for me. So that's my favorite.
Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and so during her season 6, if you're a Buffy fan, she experiences depression symptoms, and that season, there's a big split. Are any Buffy fans in here? Okay, do you like that season or no? Ish, kind of. Yeah, and so it was kind of, I don't feel like it was meant specifically to portray depression, but it was amazing how well it mapped onto that. And so I enjoyed that. And then some of the other ones we've come across are just a little bit trickier or more fun. Silent Bob, we did from the Kevin Smith movies. He had selective mutism and cannabis dependence. And so that was just kind of...
Imagine that.
I know. It's a very big surprise.
I think Logan was a really fun one after we saw the film and thinking about some of the comics, and especially Old Man Logan and some of the difficulties he faces as an older adult, vulnerability to suicide and alcohol dependence was really interesting to see that portrayed in the film. So that was another one that was really interesting and I thought worthwhile to talk about. So I don't know. There's a lot that have been fun, but those are our favorites.
How does Darth Vader's redemption at the end of Return of the Jedi fit into your psychopath theory?
Not well, would be the way. Yeah. So that is what I think is. I'm not going to answer your question. I'm just going to pivot and talk a little bit about Darth Vader. You can answer it if you have.
Actually, it's interesting. There is a phenomenon where people age out of antisocial personality disorder a little bit, and it's not clear why. Some of it is believed to be because of some of the skills developed, and others believe it's because of hormonal changes over time. It's not good to just wait decades until people reach there, but that's one possible answer. Now I'll let Brandon give you the other answer.
Non-answer was my choice. Mine was more so just to talk about how interesting Darth Vader is as a character, we thought, and it's actually where the Jedi Council project all got started, because he is probably one of the most interesting, in my opinion, characters in all of media. Just to be able to see his fall and his redemption is actually pretty amazing, and it's kind of cool because it's almost like Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader are separate beings in some way. So particularly after Anakin is defeated by Obi-Wan and a lot of his body is replaced by more like machine, he really changes in a big way and really becomes an enforcer for the Empire. And a lot of the love and compassion that you see in Anakin is really gone for a long time because he's so broken by the loss of his family and the loss, I think, of maybe his connection with the Jedi Order. But that's really brought back to him when he does meet Luke again. And I don't know, I just think it's an interesting character, I guess.
And in full disclosure, I don't think he would fit as well with the psychopath. It would be more the antisocial personality disorder. And the conclusion we actually came to on our post, but we didn't want to make the talk 80 minutes long, was narcissistic personality disorder fits him better because for this, as Brandon mentioned, you have to have some antisocial behavior before age 15, and he didn't really fit that. But he has and there's a lot of overlap between narcissistic and antisocial, just kind of the grandiosity and the callousness and things like that.
So how would you diagnose Tony Stark?
That's a good question too. So he certainly struggles with some substance dependence. I think a lot more in the comics probably than you see in the movies. It's a little bit toned down. And I would have to think about it and look into it. So I'm a lot more familiar with DC than Marvel Comics. But I would be curious, and my first jumping off point would maybe be to think about, does he fit within a narcissistic personality disorder? Because particularly in the comics, I think it's even a little more ramped up. He really is pretty confident in himself and his ability to learn things incredibly quickly and have really vast sums of knowledge. So that's just as one example of the grandiosity and that kind of supreme confidence in himself. But it's a great question and definitely probably a character that we should think about writing up one of these posts for.
Do you think that he has some kind of like complicated grief or post-traumatic stress disorder too? I mean, I'm not as familiar with the characters. I don't know if he has some of those symptoms too, related to his parents.
Maybe. Yeah, it's hard to say.
Say another interesting character that you may want to take a look at would be, I don't know if you're familiar with the TV show The Shield. Dirty Cops, basically. There's the lead character, Vic Mackey.
Mm-hmm.
I could absolutely see with the antisocial behavior on there. You know, it's about a six-season run where it talks about, it starts off with a very dark spot, goes up, and then it's the fall of the character as well. It'd be real interesting to see kind of like your dissection.
Yeah.
In there as well, the potential psychopath or antisocial behavior on there, but it'd be something to take a look at.
Yeah, that's an awesome suggestion. Thank you so much. I haven't seen The Shield. I don't think I have.
It's wonderful.
So yeah, I should check that out.
Wonderful show.
Before you nerds just start chiming off, I'm like, do this one, do this one, do this one.
Exactly.
I'm going to call it for the night. Thanks so much, Brandon and Katie, and to our other speakers, Ben and also Kate and Matt for the back. Maybe you can buy them drinks and get them to hang out for a little while if you want to talk to them more. We will be back in July on the 17th, also a Monday, 7 o'clock here at the Gastropub. Follow our Facebook, and there's a Twitter, and there's a website to stay updated.